Hello, and welcome to this PowerPoint on literary theory, which will teach you how to use literary criticism as yet another way to analyze literature. This is what I call the fourth level in the analysis that I've been teaching you. We've been focusing on character and plot, as well as theme, level 1, level 2, structure, level 3, symbols and rhetorical devices, level 4 is original interpretation, which the examiners really want to see what you can bring to the interpretation of a text. And literary theory is just another way to help you broaden your ability to analyze text. Real quick background. Critical theory has been around since ancient Greek times. Aristotle, for example, wrote a whole book on poetics and how we should analyze drama and poetry. And then it especially became prevalent in the 1800s during the Age of Enlightenment, where people felt that the more you understood about the arts and science, the better of a person you could actually be. And one of these fields to do this was literary criticism. And then during the 1900s, it really became a more structural, organized form of scholarly practice that most colleges encourage. And why do we need this? We need to understand that we as readers and writers themselves, as people, understand the world a specific way. They have a paradigm from which they interpret and perceive things. So if you think of Small Island, for example, Andrea Levy very purposefully chose 4 narrators so that one viewpoint wouldn't take over. Imagine the novel as narrated by Bernard only. We would have gotten a very skewed narration of things. Well, writers work the same way. They come from a specific background, gender, ethnicity, racial, class, all of that, and it's going to affect how they write. So critical theory helps us understand that. So then for the reader, it also challenges the way we think to help make our horizons a little broader. But of course, like most things, you learn and practice how to do this. There's many different modes. Some that we did in the historical background PowerPoint without you knowing it, you were already applying theory, but that's pretty basic. How does the author's life and how does the historical time period affect the work? But the ones we're going to focus on today are going to be one of the sociological modes, particularly post-colonial theory, and you'll see why that is so appropriate when analyzing Small Island. So there's 3 types of sociological criticisms: Marxist theory that looks at class structure, feminist theory that looks at how gender influences work, and the one we're going to look at is post-colonial. All of these basically say that the author's social structure affects how they think of their characters and the world their characters inhabit, and thus the themes they want to get across that their characters experience. Art is not created in a vacuum. Very much the social structures around an author will affect them. So we need to look at the relationship between the author and the society, which could include the social status of the author, the values that they want to present, the social values they want to present, and the role of the audience as well. So as I said, today we're going to look at post-colonial. In really the 1960s, 1970s, as readership began to move beyond just the typical European and American authors, it wasn't all just Shakespeare, Mark Twain, Robert Frost, and we started to look at more diverse literature, came a theory to examine the way those well-established pieces of literature as well as world literature was affected because of colonialism. Basically, the authors and the characters, how they were affected by their country's imperialist past, either because they were an imperial power or they were a colony of an imperial power. And one of the most important scholars was Edward W. Said, who wrote Orientalism, Western Representations of the Orient. So one of the first scholars to really kind of put this into practice and think of terms that could apply. So let's look at some of those key terms. So first of all, you probably are familiar with imperialism, but basically it was this time period of European colonization of much of the world, which came to an end starting in the 1800s. But we saw it all the way through the 1950s, like India, for example. Part of Bernard's narration is that he has to stay in India an extra year after the end of World War I to quell some of the instability as the Indians became more and more troubled by the British ruling over them. So that's very much in the story, Small Island, imperialism, even in the 1950s. In fact, Hong Kong was still part of the British Empire in the 1990s. So just 30 years ago, this was still an issue. Alterity is really important in this novel too. Alterity is when you have trouble identifying who you are because you feel like an outsider from your community, you feel different, you feel like another. Now, this might be because you're the only person of color in the community, for example. Or think of Hortense. Because of her skewed view of herself, because of her father, but also because she idealizes British culture, she has an issue with alterity, where she doesn't quite know who she is as a woman of color. The diaspora refers to any group or ethnic population that's forced to leave their traditional homeland and then is dispersed throughout the world. We live in Miami. We are a place full of different groups of diaspora, so I'm sure you guys can relate to that. That sense that you're a group of exiles who, for reasons that were outside of you, your parents, your grandparents' control, they had to leave their original homeland. Eurocentrism is the concept that we have to realize that much of our understanding of literature, art, history, even beauty, has been influenced by a very Eurocentric focus. We idealize white culture, we idealize white beauty, and we see how the characters in Small Islands grapple with that. Now, one of the positive things, though, to come from this in a post-colonial era, we need to understand what the colonial influence was and how its impact is still felt even today. But we need to embrace both those sides, that yes, my country maybe has an imperial past or we were a colony, but today maybe we can embrace both of those things and celebrate the good from both. However, like I said, some of these things are still felt today. One of those things is colorism. Colorism is a practice of discrimination by which those with lighter skin tones are treated more favorably than those with darker skin. And the three different ads that you see up there in the PowerPoint slide really show you that. They're from different parts of the world, and they're all advertising skin lightening creams. Because of our Eurocentric ideals of beauty, because of the impacts of colonial history, we still tend to think of lighter skin tones as more beautiful, as more worthy. And who in the novel Small Island believes that more than anybody else? Hortense. So we're going to talk about her later. So basically, in colonial times, those who were colonized were often seen as uncivilized versus the colonizer being considered civilized. So there's a lot of dualities between educated versus uneducated, heathen versus Christian, basically good versus evil in many, many ways. The native characters are often considered as others, and the European characters define themselves by how they are different. Think of poor Gilbert in that train incident when he is mocked and degraded and told, why don't you go back to Africa, the jungles of Africa. He's not even from Africa, he's from Jamaica, and he's being compared to something so uncivilized that needs to be lived in the jungle. So he very much experiences that. And also, since part of the novel is set in Jamaica, the idea of how the developed world is perceived is also very important, because they're still feeling the impacts of a past of foreign rule, and so their characters lack a sense of identity, especially Gilbert. One thing we need to remember is that Gilbert is biracial. His dad was European, white European, and his mom was a black Jamaican woman. And what does that mean for his identity? Part of the reason he goes to fight is to fight as a man of color, but also someone from European Jewish descent. So, like I said, more modern text sees something more positive with hybridity. In the US, we need to look at immigration as an important component of this, as well as obviously the lingering impacts of slavery and segregation. For British literature, as is the case obviously with Small Island, they did not have segregation, but obviously the ramifications of slavery were huge, and the immigration of Caribbean British people to England caused a lot of racial strife, and the novel definitely focuses on that. So let's look at passages. So I said it before, Hortense is one of the ones that really suffers with this, and you don't see it better than when she is in front of the first group of kids she's going to teach for her teaching college. She's still training. And look at how she describes them. There were 60 pupils in that first class I had to teach. 60 children fidgeting like vermin behind rows of wooden desks. 60 nappy-headed, runny-nosed, foul-smelling ragamuffins. 60 black faces. I was used to children from good homes. Mr. and Mrs. Ryder's school, where wealthy, fair-skinned, and high-class children sat unruly. She is a woman of color. She is teaching kids of color, and yet she's looking down at them because they're darker skinned, they're unruly, they're uncivilized, they're not like the light-skilled children in the school of Mr. and Mrs. Ryder. That's colorism. Don't think that the kids in Mr. and Mrs. Ryder's school were white. They were not. They were also black, but because they were lighter skinned and from good families, wealthy families, Hortense sees them as valuable and worthy to be taught, whereas these kids from a poor school are not worthy to be taught. And it's one of the reasons it's very hard to like Hortense early in the novel because of some of these ideals. But we do have to understand that she thinks this way because of the impacts of colonialism, because of the impacts of British rule in Jamaica. This is a woman who has been taught to wear gloves, to dress in English style, to make tea cakes, to speak properly, all of these things. And so anyone who doesn't meet those standards, she sees them as lesser. And that is because of her colorist colonial issues. Here's another one from her viewpoint. I could understand why it was of the greatest importance to her that slavery should not return. Her skin was so dark, but mine was not that hue. It was the color of warm honey. No one would think to enchain someone such as I. We've seen that quote of warm honey before, so we know how important it is to her that she's a lighter shade because she's like her father, not like her mother. It gives her a chance for a golden future, all of these things. But here it's even more horrible because she's saying her good friend Celia, well, she should be worried about slavery. If Hitler wins the war, then she'll definitely get enslaved, but I won't. So it shows how much her colorist tendencies have made her delusional, that she doesn't realize the risk of Hitler winning to everyone, all people of color, all minorities, regardless of whether you're lighter or darker. But she has totally bought into the concept. Her lighter hue gives her more value, and not Celia. She does something similar the first time she sees Gilbert. He's riding a bike and she's trying to chase him down because she thinks it's Michael's. This is after Michael's gone missing in Europe. But then when she comes closer to him, she realizes it wasn't. And notice what it is about Michael that she focuses on to differentiate him. Sorry, what she focuses on Gilbert to differentiate from Michael. But it was not Michael. He was a stranger. His skin was darker than Michael's. His nose was broader. His lips were thicker. His skin tone, his nose size, his lips, they are not as good as Michael's because Michael's features are more European. He's got a lighter skin tone, a smaller nose, smaller lips. So even the way that she finds a man attractive has been influenced by this. So you can see just how appropriate it is to use those post-colonial terms to analyze key characters and key scenes in the novel. Let's look at Gilbert now. Let's get away from Hortense. This is after he's initially been recruited into the RAF. He's told, oh, you're going to be an air gunner, you're going to be a flight engineer, but then he's not. He's made to be a driver instead, the thing he loathes most. And he says, only the college-educated Lenful was lucky. His trade test no better than us, but his skin a little lighter, he became a flight engineer. So he and his friends all took these tests to see if they could qualify for flight engineer. They had similar test results, but why was Lenville picked? His skin tone. And he came from a higher class family, that's why he had gone to college. So it shows you that colorism, colonial past directly influence Gilbert and his ability to move up, to get promoted within the ranks of the RAF, and in the future to get jobs. So postcolonial theory is a great way to analyze Small Island, and I hope you found this helpful to do that.